Hey friends, now let's continue and focus on user authentication. Authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a user attempting to access an application to ensure that only authorized individuals are granted access to the application. The primary goal of authentication is to confirm the user's claimed identity and ensure that they are who they say they are. The authentication process typically follows these steps. So the user requests access to an application. The user provides the necessary authentication credentials such as a username and password or a fingerprint scan. The system compares the provided credentials against the stored or pre-registered information associated with the user's identity. Based on the comparison results, the system determines whether the user's identity is confirmed and whether access should be granted or denied. The user is either allowed access to the application if authentication is successful or denied access if authentication fails. There are several ways of implementing authentication for mobile apps, but in this tutorial, we'll focus on the traditional username and password. To learn the other forms of authentication, you can have a look at my user authentication tutorial. I'll leave the link to the playlist in the description box below. In this tutorial, we look at basic authentication and bearer authentication. So in this specific video, we'll focus on basic authentication, which is a simple form of authentication that involves sending a username and password with each HTTP request. And then in the next video, we'll get to look at bearer authentication. Let's go back to our application. So we'll start by creating a repository class for our users. So we'll just proceed to our repository folder and create a new folder that will handle that. And we'll define our file as user repository .dart. So let's proceed. The syntax or the way of designing it will be as equivalent to as the ones that we have been creating. So first we'll need to create a class called user that extends. First, let's just define it here. Then let's define the variables. The variables will have an ID. Then we'll have the name. Then we'll have the username. Then we'll have the password. Great. Now let's define the constructor. Required this.id, required this.name, required this.username, and required this.password. There we have it. Then we'll extend the equitable class and inherit this getter method. We'll specify our variables inside here, which will be ID, name, username, and password. Great. So now we have our class. Next, let's create our in-memory database on the top here. So it will be a map object of type string user, and we'll call it userdb. Then we'll proceed to use a notation visible for testing. Great. Now let's create our repository class. So we'll have a user repository. Inside here, we'll define a few functions, starting with getting user from credentials. So when we're passed for the username and password, we get to check if that user exists. So let's just add a documentation here. So we're checking in our map object, which is our database, for a user with the provided username and password. Wait. So what we expect to be returned will be user. So let's work on the function inside here. We'll pick the password and hash it, so that we have the hash version, encrypted version of the password, because that's what we are storing in our in-memory database. So we'll pick password.hash value. So we're calling it from our extension method that we created. Next, we are going to define a variable called users and go to our database and check our values where user.username is equals to the username that has been passed in our function, and user.password is equals to our hashed password. Great. So after this, we now check if our variable is not empty, we'll proceed to return users. And in case there are more than two, because this is an object, if it returns more than two values of type user, we pick the first one. Great. Else return null. So we've added this null safety operator, and the probability that there's no information that the user's variable or object is empty. Now let's create an other function, which will be where we search for a user by ID. So we'll define it as user from ID, and then we'll pass in the string ID. So this function will be returning our type user. So just proceed here, and since we need to, we'll just come here and return, go to our DB and pick values of the key ID, this ID. So it's possible that that value may not be there, so we're just adding this. Next, we're going to perform a function that creates a new user. So we'll call it create user, and we'll need a few arguments in our function, starting with the name, the username, and the password. So inside here we'll be passing the after creating we'll pass the ID, which will be of type string, of the new user. So now let's work on it. So we need first the ID. As you can see in the user class, you need to pass in the ID. So to design the ID, because we don't want to manually enter it, we'll use the hash value method in our extension, and we'll use the username variable to get it. So username.hash value. So we have our ID. Then we have our name, our username, and the password. The password will encrypt it with the hash value as well. So let's design our object. Final user is equals to user. So we'll have ID, which will be ID. We'll have the username, which will be the username. We'll have the password, which will be the password time and encrypt it. Then we'll have the name, which will be the name. There we have it. Next, we're going to now add our user object into the database. So we'll just say userdb, pick the ID is equals to user. There we have it, and then we return our ID. So just let's set this to future, so that you can wait for all this operation to occur. The value ID. There we have it. Now let's work on delete. If you want to delete a user, our function ends here. So delete a user. So our function will be called delete user. And what we'll need to delete the user will be the ID. And we'll be returning future void. So inside here, all we have to do is call the DB and say remove the values in this key, or remove this key altogether. Set it to void. Then let's work on update user. So we'll call our function update user, and then inside here we will define the argument. Of course, we need the ID to use it to get the specific object that we need to update. Then we'll pass in, you can pass in the name, that is if it's the name that's being updated. That's why we're adding the null safety operator, because it may not be passed. If we are trying to update the username, we can also add that or not. That's why we're adding this as well. And lastly, it will be required string password. There we have it. So let's get inside here and work on our function. So first thing we'll do, we'll get the current value that's in this specific ID. Proceed to check if the current user is equal to null. We just do a return. We'll just set this type to future. Add in async and just say future dot error exception user not found. Else, we'll proceed to design our user object with the respective values. So if a name has been passed, we'll pick that name. Else, we'll just pick the name that is currently in the object, current.name. That's what it means. If the username hasn't been passed, so that means the user is not changing the username. So we just stick with whatever was there, username. And lastly, for the password, same thing. If you're not changing the password, we proceed to retain whatever was in the previous object. That's what it means. And now that we have done that, let's proceed to update our database. As you can see, the ID does not change. We're not updating the ID. That's what creates the uniqueness of this object. And we're done. So we've created all our functions in our repository. We have designed how our user class should look like. Now let's go to the roots folder and create a root that focuses on authentication. So I'll just come here, dartfrog, new root. We'll just call it authentication. And in this video, we're focusing on the basic. CD, navigate to my project. And then if we come here, here's our folder. Here's our, supposed to call it index. Let me just rename that. Then let's define the middleware. New middleware. Authentication basic. Seem to be doing the wrong thing. Move. So it should be here. They should all be here. Okay, now let's work on our middleware first. Can minimize this. So in our middleware, we're going to set our handler, user provider. Let's use the use method and set our provider and inject the instance of the user repository that we have created. So it will be of type user repository. And we'll pass in the user repository. Next thing we'll do is, let me just close this. So we have that. We're going to perform use the use method again, but we're going to do something else. So what we're going to do, we're going to use a specific middleware that's based on authentication that dartfrog already has. We'll import it and we'll use that to help us perform basic authentication, and we'll inject it. So what it's going to help us check, it's going to have an authenticator feature that will authenticate for us the user before they perform any requests in our index or in our root handler. Let me show you how. So we'll go to our terminal and install pub add dartfrog auth. That's what it's called. So you enter that and it will create for you. So this is what we're going to use in our project. So how to use it first, you just call the basic. Let me import it first. So we'll come here and import. There it is. so that we can use this basic authentication. It's the one that will help us authenticate our users, and then we define it with a type of user, our user class. And then inside here we're going to apply a few things. We're going to use this authenticator, which will help us verify the user's identity before granting them access to the root handler and for them to proceed processing their requests. So this authenticator will require a few parameters. Let's first call it, and it will require the context, the username, and the password. Let's set it up there. So once you pass the username, the password, and then the context, the request context, what we do inside here is first define a variable that holds, that gets the injected. You see, we had injected an instance of user repository, so we are getting it over here first. And now that we have it, we want to do a return repository. It is dot user from credentials. We had defined this variable, so we just want to get a user from these credentials, the username and the password, and we set it like so. So what it will do, it will check in the database for a user with this username and this password, and if it's valid, that's when it will proceed to go to the root handler, and the root handler would perform whichever request it needs. And then another thing we'll do, if you look at the basic authentication, it also has another attribute called applies. So what we're going to do here, once we're done here, we're going to call this attribute, and then what we want to tell, let me just call this, but what is we're passing here is a request context, and this will determine the request should be authenticated, or this authentication process, it only applies if the HTTP method is not a post. Let me show you how. So it will just say context dot request dot method is not equal to dot post. Like that. So as you can see, we are setting it if it's not equal to post. What this means is when we use the post method, this is, in this case, it's where we want to create a user. So we don't want to authenticate a user at the point of creating a user because they don't have the credentials yet. So that's what we're specifying here. So if the HTTP method is not a post, that means if it's a get, if it's a delete, if it's a patch, it has to pass through this process of authentication before it's processed. So our index, we are about to proceed to that, but in our index, what we'll have is the function, or we're going to handle the HTTP method post, which will handle creating a user. But we'll create another dynamic route over here that will handle now the get. If you want to get information of a specific user, the delete and the patch. Now, for you to actually get into that route handler for the dynamic route, it has to validate first if the username and the password is correct. So that's what applies does. So if we decide to say it's not equal to get, whichever HTTP method that is a get, in case we had set this to get, that means if it's a get HTTP method, it won't go through this authentication, but a post, a delete, and a patch has to go through the authentication first. But for us, we just need to set it to post, because when a user is creating new credentials, they don't have the credentials to be authenticated. They have to be created first, get the credentials, and then onwards when they're logging in, when they're updating or deleting, that's when they have to be authenticated. I hope that makes sense. And that's how our middleware looks like. Let me just okay. So now let's go to our index. And in our index, we'll do the usual. We are going to handle a post. So let's proceed. So we'll do a return switch, pass in our context dot request dot method, and inside here we are going to define the first case for post and pass in a function. This function will be create user, and it will be of type future dynamic response, async. Let's call this, and we need to pass in the request context. Else, let's define the default case. Let me just pass this. Let's define the default case, future.value response. We'll define the status code as HTTP method status, dot method not allowed. Now let's work on our create user. So we'll pick whatever is passed from the body, context.request.json, and cast it as a map string dynamic. Then we're going to pick the name, the username, and the password, because that's what we need when we are creating a user, as string. Then we'll have the username as string. Then we'll have the password as string. Let me see, semicolon. Okay, so we have them. Let's get our repository, user repository instance, repository instance from our injected dependency injection. Read user repository, and then we're going to do a check if name is not equal to null, because it's probable it could. If username is not equal to null, and password, because all of them have to have a value, we'll proceed to run. You call the user repository and call the function create user, and then we'll pass our name, username, and password. Great. Then it will return a string ID, so we need to get that, and then we proceed to return it to the user. So we define our body, just say ID. Great. And after if, we'll just do an else and do a return response and define the status code as bad request. And there we have our function. We can test this on our terminal. So in our terminal, we'll proceed to say call request, and then it's a post. So let's define our root. It will be authentication basic, and then our body will have name John Doe, then we'll have the username J Doe, and then we'll have our password 1234. Let's start our development server, sorry. So all you have to do is run dartfrog dev. Just a minute. So it's running. Back to our terminal, let's execute this. So it says failed. Okay, let's give it a minute. Now let's try internal server error. So back to our code, let's see what the problem is. Future dynamic is not, I think I know what this is. I keep forgetting to pass a wait over here. So let's try again. Back to our terminal. Let's execute this. And there we have our ID. So we have been able to create a new user, but we can't see it yet because we haven't performed the HTTP GET request. So let's work on that next. Back to our application, we'll come over here and create another root. And call it ID. Let's open our ID dynamic root file. We'll clear all this and do the usual. So run return switch, pass in the method context.request.method, and inside here our first case will be http method.get. We'll pass in a function. Let's define our function get user by ID. So we'll just need the request context and the string ID. Set this to future response. Copy this function and pass it here. Pass the context and the ID. The next case will be .patch. Let's define the function and name it update user. Let's copy this, paste it here, and pass the context and the ID. Next case will be http method.delete. Let's define our function delete user. Copy this, paste it here, pass it the arguments. And lastly, let's handle the default case. So we'll come here and define this as a future. Set the async keyword. And then we'll proceed to define the response. define the status code to method not allowed, which we'll find in the library.io. Great, so that's done. So now let's work on get user. So all we have to do is define final user let's initiate it. Let's call the instance of user repository that we injected, and then we'll proceed to call user from ID and pass the ID. So it will return a user object that holds this specific ID. So we want to do a check if user.id is not equal to ID. We'll return a response and set the status code forbidden. So let's add an async here. Let's pass in await here. Okay, then if it's equivalent, we'll return a response.json. Define our body and pass ID user.id, name, user.name, and username. And another way to do it is by implementing JSON serialization in our user repository. I'll let you do that as a challenge for yourself. We had already discussed about JSON serialization in one of our lessons, and we implemented that in the two of our repositories. So you just go head over there and try and implement that in our user repository as a challenge for yourself. If you do that, you won't have to specify this over here. Great. Now that we have our get user, let's test it out. We'll head over to the terminal. Since it's a call request get, and then let's pass in the right which will be authentication basic, and let's pass the ID. We already have a user here. Let's just paste that and enter. So getting an error of 401, it's forbidden. We'll just say call request post. So let's just create this user again and enter. Now that we have that, we're going to pass in a call request post, not post, call request get. So we want to get, but now the way we're getting it is we'll pass this ID will be equivalent to this, and then which is actually the same because the information that we're providing here is the same one. And then our header should be authorization basic, and this is equivalent to the current username is jdo, Let me give an example here. JDO, and the password is 1234. So you pick this and generate a base 64 encoded string for this. So just by doing that with an online platform that generates a base 64, we should also have a function for that. But let's just test it first, then we create it. It produces this type of string. So if we click on enter, okay, we have an error. Let's see what's wrong. Let's see. Okay, so the only thing I've done is pushed the provider injection as the last part of the handler, and it seems to work. So if you look at our code, we've been able to generate information about this specific ID. So our function is working. Let's proceed to work on the delete and the update. This has taken us a little longer because of this part, but at least now you've understood how basic authentication or how the dartfrog auth works. For basic, our request has to look quite different. It has to have, the header has to have the authorization key, and then the value will be basic, and then the encoded base64 encoded version of username and password. Great. So in case you're asking, so for the base64, the function itself, we'll have it in the app level because this request is supposed to be pushed from the app level. So we'll create a simple function that converts our string containing the username and password, then pass it in our header. So back to our code. Now let's work on the remaining two. We have update. Since we have been able to handle the issue that we had in the middleware, we expect that the update and the delete goes smoothly. But at least we have learned something from there. So the only thing I did was I was creating a new, I'm supposed to create a variable, a private variable that will be used within this middleware over here, then just pass this. I think it stores it's more of like the way we talked about data caching. It stores the information, so it isn't a new user repository that's created when you're passing. If you pass in here a new user repository class, you'll find that it will come in with the user db empty. So if we define a private variable that we can use throughout the cycle of within this route, we're able to persist the data that is stored in the user DB. So we can proceed to pick what is in the body. So we'll say final body is equals to context.request.json and cast it as a map string dynamic. Then we'll proceed to call get the name from the body as string, get the username from the body as username as string, and get the password body password as string. So we have the data that's passed in our patch request. Next thing we want to do is get the instance of the user repository. Is equals to context.read of type user repository, and then we'll proceed to do a check. So what we'll do, let's see, in our user repository, how do we do our update? So already we are checking if that type of ID exists. Okay, so we don't need to check it again over here. So we'll just proceed to check that the information on the name, the username, and the password is not null. So we'll do an or, because when you're updating, doesn't mean that the user wants to update all the values. So just say is equals to null, or password is not equal to null. If so, let's proceed to use our variable, our instance of user repository dot update. Let's just pass an async here. So we just pushed it and it has picked up all the information. Great. And now let's do a return response status code http status dot no content, but it will come with the no content also comes with the status code 200, so that means we'll know that it has gone through successfully. Else let's do a return response and specify our status code as bad request. There we have it. So let's try and test this and see how this goes. So back to our terminal. Again. We'll just clear that. Do a curl request post. Enter curl request get same IDE. Okay. And then we do a curl request patch same ID. Then we do a curl request get So if we go back to a user repository on the update user, there's a small mistake, small thing that we didn't add, which is if you look at this password that's being passed, it's a, how do we say it? It's a decoded, it's a plain text or a plain string, right? But what should be saved in the user DB is an encoded version using the hash value method in the extension that we have. So instead of passing this, let's say in case a user decides to, if you pass the name, username, and password when you're updating, what will happen here? Since the password of ID is not null, there's a value. It will update with whatever has been passed. But unfortunately, whatever we are passing in curl request is a plain text. So if it's still that plain text, we'll always have issues when getting, because they get uses the username and the hash value of the password. So in short, what I'm saying is that we should do something like, if password is not equal to null, if the users decide to pass the password, or in case where we implement a feature of update or change password and they pass the password, we need to reinitiate that password is equals to the password dot hash value, so that whatever is stored is the hash, the SHA-256 version of the password. And I don't think we'll have any issues with the authentication now, because our issue was mainly on the 401, the authentication process, because in our middleware we have to be authenticated first before we proceed to updating. Okay, so let's try this again and see. If we go back to our terminal, let's create a new user, like let's come here and do a post. Let's add someone like that, and then we just set the username as so, and post. So we have an ID. Let's do a call request for get, and we'll just use this ID and come here and get our and set our string ID. There we have it. And then we have to change this encoded string. It's equivalent to Jeff, the encoded version of Jeff colon 1234. So let me get that. But we are going to create a function on the app level that will generate that for us. And so that we can pass it in our headers. So we have it here. Let's delete this space. So make sure there's only one space between basic and the encoded. So if we enter, we're able to get the information about Jeff. And if we decide to update, let's decide to update. So we'll come here on the header and update the encoded string. I hope you're seeing how authentication, you can implement authentication. This is the whole deal. Then we'll pick the ID here, proceed to delete this. And then let's change the name. So our username has to be the same. Jeff. What we can change is the name. Jeff Bezos Amazon. Let's click on enter. Now let's try and do a get of this. Okay, where have we gone wrong? So we have oh, the username, my goodness. Let's update the username that we were not supposed to change. No, I changed it. Jeff. Let's try a get. Man. Okay, let's see our patch. We have our username, we have our password, we've just changed the name, we have the correct encoded string. Okay, so there we have it. We did a patch here. We've just changed the name Jeff Bezos Amazon. It was initially Jeff Bezos, so now it has updated. When we try and push a get with a specific ID, here is the name that we have changed. So our update is working. Let's proceed to our delete right here. So inside here, so let's proceed to, we'll just use the same method from the user repository to get the user by ID. Let's pass in a sync. And then we'll just pass in all this. Start by saying if the user is equals to null, we return status forbidden, else we'll do another check where if user.id is not equal to ID, we also say forbidden, else we'll just delete. So instead of this, we'll change all this and proceed to call the instance of the user repository and say dot delete and pass the ID. And then we'll proceed to return a response status code http status dot no content. There we have it. So let's try and delete. So back to our terminal, we just do a call request, then we just pass in here delete. We're using the correct ID and we're passing the correct encoded. So let's try and enter that. So no content. So if we try and do a get, we won't get any value because we've deleted our user. Great. So with that, we have been able to implement the basic authentication, and the majority of the logic involving basic authentication is found in the middleware. As you can see in the middleware, we had to use the dartfrog auth middleware provided by dartfrog, and it has a very amazing way to plug in a logic where you have to authenticate a user before they perform any request that is not a post. If it's a post, it goes through without authentication, which makes sense because when you're creating a user. But if you're updating, deleting, or getting any information, it passes. Your request has to pass through this basic authentication, which is awesome. So now let's proceed to the next lesson.